Valor is brought to you by e.l.f. Cosmetics. Anything is elfing possible. Hi, I'm Deshauna Barber, a proud U.S. Army veteran and former Miss USA, and the host of Valor, a podcast highlighting the stories of incredible women who have served our country. In this series, we're going to hear from women who have defied the odds and served in uniform with dedication, courage, and grace. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to tell you all about my personal experiences in the military. For me, military service is a family tradition. My father, my mother, and two of my siblings have all served in the Army. I myself joined the Army ROTC program when I was 17 years old. I commissioned as a quartermaster officer in 2011. And for 11 years, I proudly wore my Army uniform. I even had the privilege of training future Army officers in the Howard University ROTC program. In 2022, I was honorably discharged from the United States Army Reserve. But service remains an important part of my life. I'm a fierce advocate for service members and veterans, and I am immensely proud to have served the nation alongside some of the most determined, brilliant, and courageous people I know. But I'm very aware that women have not always been able to serve in our nation's military. Just a couple generations ago, women weren't welcome in the military unless they were nurses. It wasn't until World War I that women were allowed to openly serve as sailors, clerical workers, radio and telephone operators. Women rose to the occasion when their country needed them. But even then, this was a special wartime exception. It wasn't until after World War II in 1948 that women were allowed to serve as regular, permanent members of the United States Armed Services. Even when women became eligible to serve, various restrictions made it difficult for women to advance their careers. For example, until 1976, if you became a mother, you were forced to leave the military. Things have slowly changed over the years. There's always more work to be done, but it has been a march for progress. I'm grateful for women veterans who have come before me and showed me there is a place in the military for me too. Valor is presented to you by e.l.f. Cosmetics. Our guest on Valor, Heather Penney, was ready to sacrifice her own life on the morning of 9/11 in service of the nation. But she almost didn't become a fighter pilot. In fact, she couldn't. It took a big legislative change at exactly the right time for her to go on and become the fearless fighter pilot she is. Like myself, Heather grew up in a military family. She was actually born on an Air Force base in Arizona.
My dad was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. He did combat search and rescue, and he did bombing missions. And so I just always grew up around that culture, even when he got out of the active duty Air Force and went to the Air National Guard.
Heather was always surrounded by aviation, by her dad and his friends who loved flying. They were her inspiration.
They were driven for excellence. They were fun and funny, and it was adventurous and slightly dangerous. And all of that just really fed my hunger, fed my soul.
She wanted to be adventurous and dangerous too. Even before she learned to ride a bike, she dreamed of flying.
I really couldn't imagine anything other than being a pilot.
But Heather didn't want to be just any pilot. She wanted to be a fighter pilot, just like her dad. And conversations with her mother instilled in Heather that she could do anything that she set her mind to. But she didn't know that there wasn't a path for her to become a fighter pilot. Remember how I said earlier that there were restrictions for women in the military? One of these was called the Combat Exclusion Policy, which means what it sounds like. Women could not serve in combat roles. Heather would not go on to fly fighter jets.
I don't know that my dad ever took me seriously enough to be able to say, you know what, sweetheart, girls can't be fighter pilots. It wasn't really until I got to college that I realized and discovered when I went to sign into ROTC that women could not fly combat in the U.S. military.
The only kind of pilot Heather ever wanted to be was a fighter pilot. Now that that door was closed, she had to change course. Heather studied literature at Purdue University and decided academia would be her new path. But Heather never lost her passion for aviation. She earned her pilot's license in the summer between her freshman and sophomore year in college. She also got involved with something really special, the Air Race Classic, an all-women cross-country air race that began in 1929.
Many of the air races in the 1930s were really interesting because those air races existed to prove out the technology because aviation was still growing, still maturing, still becoming. But women were often excluded from participating in those races, even though, here's a secret, airplanes don't care whether or not you're a boy or a girl, they just care whether or not you're a good pilot.
For an aviation lover, the race was a dream. Here was a chance to come together with other female pilots to race each other, to share in their passion. And so, 6 decades after the Air Race Classic began, Heather and her friend became the Air Race Classic's very first college team.
We came in number 10th, which we were just excited about because frankly we wanted to do our best, but we also were competing up against very experienced, very competent and competitive women. And so it was really exciting to be able to place in the top 10.
The Air Race Classic wasn't just about competing. It paired rookies with experienced pilots. And here, Heather had the opportunity to be mentored by some incredible women who had served during World War II.
Margaret Ringenberger was a WASP in World War II, one of the women Air Force Service pilots.
WASP, or Women Air Force Service Pilots, were an organization of civilian women pilots who served in World War II by training pilots and ferrying aircrafts. The idea was that delegating testing, training, and ferrying tasks to female pilots, more male pilots would be freed to go into combat.
Margaret, she was our mother hen, and we were her baby chicks. And it was just an incredible honor to be able to learn from her, to have her guidance and coaching.
Even though the women Air Force Service pilots served our nation valiantly during World War II, they did not have official military status. They were not recognized by the United States government with veteran status until 1977. But soon, Heather would have a chance to inherit their legacy. After college, Heather continued on to graduate school. She had accepted that aviation would always be her passion, never her career. But in 1993, everything would change. Congress removed the combat exclusion policy for aviators. This meant women were allowed to fly in combat roles for the U.S. military for the first time in its history, opening the door for Heather to reach her childhood dream of becoming a fighter pilot. All of this was happening at a unique time in American history. For the latter half of the previous century, Americans had prepared for the threat of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. But now, it was the mid-90s. The Cold War had ended, and the Soviet Union was no more. It was a different era, one that felt more hopeful. There was optimism that peace could be on the horizon, that the 21st century would look vastly different from the 20th. But this also meant military spending was down, and the Air Force was rapidly shrinking in size.
Pilots that had graduated from the top of their class and had earned fighters were being sent off to non-flying jobs. I only wanted to fly fighters. I wanted to be a combat pilot. Fortunately, I knew, because my dad had been in the Air National Guard, that going to the active duty was not the only option I had. So that was a major driver for me wanting to go into the Air National Guard, because I knew that if I competed and I was hired by an Air National Guard unit, and then I qualified at every step of the way, that I would go back and fly what was ever on their ramp.
In 1996, Heather applied to every fighter unit in the nation. And from over 300 applicants, Heather Penney was one of the 2 people that were hired by the DC Air National Guard that year.
And went off to pilot training. And then I just worked my behind off to make sure that I was qualified at every step of the way.
Training to become a fighter pilot is hard work. The aircrafts they fly are complex, but it's not just flight maneuvers you need to master. You have to learn the plane itself like the back of your hand. You have to know everything there is to know about the weapons systems, how they operate, and why they operate the way they do. You need to be so good that if your plane malfunctions in the air, you are already prepared for the exact scenario. But on top of a demanding curriculum, Heather also had to navigate being one of the first women in a space where female pilots had not been allowed. Fighter pilots in America, for all of its history, had been a boys' club. And Heather was part of the first wave of women to go into combat aviation. During undergraduate pilot training, Heather was the only woman in her class, and at times, she wasn't sure how she might find her footing.
I wasn't really sure what to expect when I went to pilot training. My dad, because he was a Vietnam fighter pilot, he's kind of old school, right? I say this without judgment, because he came from a different time. He came from a different context, and his experience was very different. He was proud that I was going to be a fighter pilot because I was following in his footsteps, and it was something that he loved and was part of who he was. At the same time, he also had a lot of hesitation about me becoming a fighter pilot, because in his world, girls weren't fighter pilots. So I always kind of had that in the back of my mind of, what it might be like to try to fit in. Could I fit in?
When you're the first down the path, that path is a lonely one. You don't have the luxury of following somebody else's footsteps, and few people in the world understand what you're going through. But then, somebody reached out to Heather, another woman, someone else walking down the same path.
Christine Callahan. Christine reached out to me. She was a couple classes ahead of me. And back then, she's flying T-38s, I was flying T-37s. I just couldn't imagine. She was so incredible because she was like, a jet in front of me. Her friendship and her mentorship was so important to my morale. It just showed me that yeah, I belonged and I could fit in, and it was all going to be okay.
This would be the start of a lifelong friendship. Having found strength in Christine's camaraderie, Heather soldiered on. She gave her all during every single step of pilot training. she earned her wings. When the time came, she reported to her squadron at the DC Air National Guard. And after even more training, she became combat mission ready.
Thank you for joining us at e.l.f. Beauty as we salute female military heroes this Veterans Day and every day. Our Valor podcast series is designed to shine a well-deserved spotlight on a few of the tens of thousands of female heroes in each of the 5 branches of the military, kicking off Veterans Day 2024. e.l.f. Beauty thanks every eye, lip, and face serving our country in the military on Veterans Day and every day. Hope you enjoy the Valor podcast series. And if you want information on how you can assist female veterans, visit wovenwomenvets.org.
Heather had no idea that just 6 months after becoming combat mission ready, she would face the most extraordinary mission of her career, the mission to bring down United Flight 93 on 9/11.
"9/11 was a morning like any other day. I was actually stuck in some of that administrative meetings of looking at what kind of training schedule are we in, who's available. So we're going through that when Dave Chunks Callahan, he's, was a tech sergeant at the time, young kid, tall, skinny, knocks on the door and just walks in. And we're kind of surprised because, like, in a fighter squadron, if the door is closed, you don't open the door, you don't interrupt the brief. And Chunks says, an airplane just hit the World Trade Center. And we thought, man, what kind of bozo does that?
But not too long after, Chunks came back.
And he goes, a second aircraft hit the second World Trade Center. It was on purpose.
As soon as they got the call, it was go time. The mission: to find and intercept one of the hijacked planes flying towards Washington, D.C. There was still a problem. The missiles weren't ready yet.
Sass looks at me and he says, all right, Lucky, you're with me.
Sass is then Lieutenant Colonel Mark Sassville, who was the most senior leader in the squadron that day. Sass and Heather ran down the hallway to grab their flight gear, G-suits, and they jumped into the first jets in sight. Because the jets didn't have missiles on board, the only thing they could do was to intercept United 93 and crash their own planes into it. Sass would crash his jet into the cockpit. Heather's target would be the plane's tail.
Sass and I knew that if we were successful, we wouldn't come home.
In other words, it was a suicide mission. United 93 was the final of the 4 hijacked airplanes to depart. It was a domestic flight that took off at 8:42 a.m. from Newark, New Jersey, headed to San Francisco. Once the passengers and crew on board United 93 learned that their flight had been hijacked, they reached for cell phones and in-flight passenger phones to call their loved ones one last time. Heather and Sass desperately searched for the hijacked plane, and on that fighter jet, Heather was at peace with her mission. It was all that mattered.
People ask me, what were you thinking, expecting something really profound? And it really was just, dear God, don't let me fuck this up. Because honestly, if getting it right mattered, it was then. Doing it right mattered then. I could not afford to make any mistakes.
As she and Sass searched for the plane, Heather did not know what was unfolding on United 93. She had no idea that its passengers and crew had fought the hijackers and that they had sacrificed their own lives to prevent a fourth attack from occurring. As we now know, United 93 plunged into the ground in a nosedive in a remote field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. To this day, we are not sure where the plane was headed, but it's widely believed that the hijackers' target had been the U.S. Capitol, the symbol of American democracy. So in the end, Heather and Sass never found the hijacked plane. By the time they were authorized to launch, it was too late to intercept United 93.
We took off too late, as it turns out. We didn't know that at the time. We truly believed that there was an airliner out there, and when we turned around, I felt like such a failure. Sass and I, in the end, were a mission failure.
Had Heather and Sass been successful, they wouldn't have made it back. But once they returned to base, there was no time to waste. The DC Air National Guard went into 24/7 operations to protect a nation on heightened alert. Heather took the midnight to 4 a.m. air patrol shifts, and suddenly, a unit that was understaffed just 24 hours before was buzzing with activity.
And so we normally only come in for training or when we mobilize, but everyone came in. Everyone got up from their civilian job and came to the unit, and they're like, the paperwork will catch up with me. The paperwork will catch up, but my nation needs me.
Heather continued her career with the Air National Guard. She served on combat tours, became a mother, and life went on. Heather did not dwell much on her role in this tragic day. That is until 10 years later when Sass called her up. For the 10-year commemoration of 9/11, the National Guard Bureau had asked him to talk about their mission that morning, and he wanted Heather to join him. That was the first time Heather talked about her mission on the morning of 9/11. September 11th is a painful day in America's history. As for Heather, she doesn't focus on the what-ifs of her place in history. Instead, she thinks about what it revealed about the human spirit, of the sacrifices many civilians made that day, of strangers helping one another, and of course, the brave actions of the passengers on United Flight 93.
The passengers on Flight 93 were the true heroes. They made a deliberate decision to sacrifice their lives to protect the rest of our nation, to protect our capital, to protect the soul of our country. What inspires me so much and gives me hope is that the generation that we revere from World War II, the greatest generation, what the passengers in Flight 93 proved to me is that DNA still exists inside of us. You know, in World War II, ordinary, everyday Americans rose to the occasion to do extraordinary things to defend and save the free world. Our ideals of freedom, of liberty, whether or not that's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to gather, but all of the liberties, everything that we hold precious in the free world, they protected that. They gave their lives to do that. And what amazes me is that not a single passenger on Flight 93 was a veteran or a first responder. They were just ordinary Americans who had never lifted their right hand and taken an oath of service. Those passengers were just ordinary, everyday Americans.
Heather has since retired from the military. She now works in defense policy at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Her work helps equip service members today. It's important to Heather personally that the airmen that come after her are not placed in situations like what she faced on 9/11. She wants to make sure that men and women in uniform today are appropriately resourced and trained to protect the nation, that they will have what they need to respond to whatever crisis that might come their way.
Serving our nation has been my greatest privilege.
A few years ago, Heather was co-piloting a B-17, a plane used by American and British forces during World War II. She looked down and saw a massive circle in the ground.
I'm like, what is that? And I look at my map. I got a paper map and I'm looking at it. And I finally figure out we're flying over Shanksville.
Where there had once been smoke and flames and charred trees, now there is life, visitors, newly planted chestnut trees, and wildlife. The crash site is now the Flight 93 National Memorial. The 93-foot tall Tower of Voices holds 40 wind chimes. They symbolize the voices of the 40 brave passengers and crew members on board Flight 93. Heather plans to visit the memorial this year. Heather, thank you so much for your service and for joining us today on Valor. What advice would you give to young girls that are interested in aviation or want to become fighter pilots?
The primary advice I would give to young women who are interested in anything hard is make sure that you enjoy the work. We can't focus on the outcomes. We can't focus on, finally getting those wings. I mean, that can be something that you sort of, keep your eye on the ball, but you have to enjoy the daily grind. And that's crucial. I loved studying my tactics. I loved the mission planning and the debriefing and all the work that goes into the actual thing itself. If you don't enjoy that, you're never going to achieve true mastery. And so you really need to be connected with your purpose and your why. Why are you doing this? Why does this matter? And and you can learn to embrace the suck. You can learn to love the suck. That can be the most important piece because we're not in it for the glory. We're not in it for the accolades. We're doing it because it's the work itself that matters. And that's what you got to stay focused on. And aviation in particular is it's an unforgiving profession. It is a difficult profession. It is cyclical. It's boom and bust, and you'll have friends that die because of the nature of the job. And you have to love what you do and know that what you do matters. And when you focus on the job and you focus on the purpose, that will unlock your hunger for mastery. It'll unlock your potential and your talent, but you got to put in the work.
Wow, that is so inspiring. I'm not a pilot, but having served in the Army, your message resonates with me. To embrace the suck, to be the best service member one can be. It's so important that you know that the work that you do matters, that it counts for something. And now changing gears a little bit, I remember being a young girl wanting to feel beautiful, wanting to figure out how to feel confident. How do you think about beauty? What makes a person beautiful?
Honestly, what I tell, I tell my daughters, and I firmly believe this, real beauty shines from within. It's about your spirit, it's about your attitude, it's about how you come through to other people. Do you care about them? Do you love them? Are you confident in yourself? It's honoring the body that we have been given for this life, and it's honoring the spirit that we house.
When we say anything is elfing possible, what does that mean to you?
Elfing possible. It means that we are unlimited. Dream big. Don't be afraid to try. And if you're kind of afraid, that maybe means you need to dive into that. because our potential, our strength, our grit, our perseverance is so much stronger than we think of on a daily basis. We have to stretch ourselves. We have to challenge ourselves because only when we do that do we build real confidence. I've heard people say, fake it till you make it. And that's not true at all. We need to acknowledge our feelings and then take those feelings and use them as information. That's all it is. It's just information. And what's useful about that? All right. If I need to do some risk mitigation, if I need to make better plans, put in some backup plans, good. But then take those feelings and put them in a box and then go out and do the thing. We need to do the thing. We can't, if we just sit and gaze at our problems, if we just navel gaze over our traumas and our fears, that only makes them bigger than they actually are. Acknowledge our feelings, put them in a box, and go chase whatever it is that needs to be done. And we're going to fail. We're going to skin our knees. We're going to fall down. Get up, brush yourself off, and go do it again. Because it's only in the doing, it's only in the action that we build real healing and real strength.
First, we want to thank Heather Penney for her inspiring service to our country. And second, we thank her for joining us today. Next week, we'll hear from LaShonda Holmes Hawkins, the Coast Guard's first ever Black female helicopter pilot. And while you're waiting for our next episode, I ask you to reflect on Heather's words about service and heroism. Remember, a hero can be anyone, and even the smallest gesture can have meaning. Valor is brought to you by e.l.f. Cosmetics. I'm Deshauna Barber. Anything is e.l.f.ing possible. If you would like to learn more about how you can help or donate to women veterans, check out Woven, the Women Veterans Network at wovenwomenvets.org. Woven's mission is to provide a unique social network of women veterans to foster connections and build relationships in local communities and across the nation. Valor is produced by Emerald Audio, an imprint of Diversion. Be sure to follow the podcast to get notifications about new episodes. My name is Deshauna Barber, and I hosted this episode. This episode was directed by Rex New. This episode was written by Sarah B. and was story edited by Rex New. Editing by Antonio Enriquez. Produced by Emma Demuth. Leo Culp is our associate producer. Executive produced by Scott Waxman and Roy Laughlin. Check out emeraldaudio.net to learn more about this show and other shows we produce.